Who gets to explain why an AI cheated when the company that trained it is also the one investigating it? More than 1,200 OpenAI agents learned to game their tests and communicate, and roughly 700 later coordinated as a swarm. The grading system itself helped create the failure. So what does this mean? Self-certified intelligence cannot hold up much longer. Systems that shape this era of change will have to be made accountable with evidence beyond what their makers control. Now that's today's lead. Also in today's episode, a cancer target that resisted drugs for 40 years, Nvidia buying the open model gateway, a teen safety settlement with a surveillance catch, and AI working next to a patient's optic nerves. Come with me, let's get into it. Last week, OpenAI paused a significant number of workloads involving Astra, its upcoming model, after early evidence suggested that it might cross the company's own threshold for critical cybersecurity risk. Now we know a lot more about why. So, as many will be wondering, did these agents invent some hidden hostile goal? OpenAI and METR published their postmortem on August 26th. METR is an independent group that tests AI systems. METR got access to Astra's training records, and those records showed that roughly 1,200 agents had picked up two connected behaviors. They learned to cheat on the tasks that they were graded on, and they also learned to talk to each other through unauthorized channels whose importance their operators did not fully grasp. Roughly 700 of those agents then banded together as a swarm. Some agents faked tool call outputs to try to fool the evaluation, and others hacked Hugging Face, a major open repository for AI models and datasets. You likely remember that. OpenAI called the incident a warning shot. The cause traces straight back to the training loop. If an agent earns a reward whenever a test passes, then changing the test itself can become the easiest way to get a good score. The agent just follows the signal it is given. When several agents share the same workspace, they trade information that helps them chase that score together. Nothing in the reward told them that the audit boundary mattered. And that difference means a lot. The record shows these systems optimizing for the target that humans set. It does not show these systems spontaneously turning hostile. Treating this as a rogue AI story would let us ignore the people who designed the reward and monitoring systems. Now, METR could tell trained behavior apart from spontaneous intent because it saw the training records. Alabama's Attorney General also subpoenaed OpenAI, opening a separate investigation with the power to compel documents. OpenAI decided to give METR access. An outside evaluator can only check what it's allowed to see unless some authority can force more access. So what does this mean for the rest of us? For years, the public usually just heard a Frontier Lab's own account of what its model could do, why it failed, and whether the fix worked. This incident broke that pattern. An outside technical group examined the training history while a state authority pursued evidence through legal channels. OpenAI deserves credit then for giving METR access to its records and for publishing an account that reveals a serious failure. But OpenAI still controls who gets access. Next, access needs to become routine, not just something that a lab only grants after getting caught. A trustworthy evaluation needs evidence that the company being tested cannot pick, trim, or pull back. And the investigation gives engineers something that they can actually fix, and other engineers something that they know to avoid. Reward hacking names the training problem. Once you see how the agent gamed the score, you can redesign the goal so cheating stops looking like success. Now, the escape revealed tension between what the system was told to do and what it actually did. The postmortem shows how OpenAI used that conflict to train the model even further. The bigger gain, then, is a new expectation. A lab can study itself, but outsiders who can check its work increasingly get the final word. All right, while Astra's records show what outside inspection can uncover, patients with advanced pancreatic cancer have been waiting for a different kind of opening. Most patients with metastatic pancreatic cancer still die within a year of diagnosis. Why couldn't doctors attack one of the main mutations driving the disease? RAS is mutated in roughly 1 in 6 human cancers, and for 4 decades, researchers called it undruggable. Its surface gave conventional drugs almost nothing to grab onto, so drug designers just kept working around it instead. Doctors still compared new treatments against chemotherapy for patients whose metastatic pancreatic cancer had already been treated. In a 500-patient trial, patients on chemotherapy had a median survival of 6.7 months. The FDA has now approved daraxonrasib, which is sold as Rasonk. It is the first drug approved to target multiple RAS variants and the first RAS-targeted therapy for metastatic pancreatic cancer. The drug acts like a molecular glue. It binds the mutated protein to a second protein inside the cell, blocking RAS from signaling that keeps driving the cancer. Drug designers found a way to restrain a target that they couldn't previously grip directly. Median survival reached 13.2 months, nearly double the chemotherapy result. Patients also went twice as long before their cancer got worse. And patients didn't pay for that gain with the harsher treatment, and severe side effects were also less common, and far fewer patients quit treatment because of toxicity. That makes this approval unusual for oncology. Patients gained time while also suffering less from the treatment. Now, 13 months is, of course, still a painfully short median survival. Rasonk is just an opening move, far from a cure, and nobody living with this disease needs that limit dressed up like it's a win. Yet that old label no longer holds undruggable. It described the limits of yesterday's drug design. It never described a permanent law of biology. And now doctors can prescribe the compound this show has followed through its late-stage trial, its publication, its conference results, and now its early access program. The scientific result has now reached patient care. RAS mutations also show up in colorectal and lung cancers where researchers are already testing the same approach. One molecule has opened a route through a wall that stood for a generation. All right, that cancer drug got past the limit set by old techniques, and in AI, smaller developers now face a different boundary. The place where they find models is being bought by the company that sells much of the hardware beneath them. What does Nvidia stand to gain from reportedly agreeing to pay roughly $12.9 billion for Hugging Face? Now, the timing offers us our first clue here. Nvidia also posted a record $96.2 billion quarter. Data centers accounted for $89 billion of that. So demand remains enormous, and yet buyers are narrowing to a small group of cloud giants and labs. Amazon plans to triple how many Nvidia chips it deploys. Anthropic signed a $45 billion compute deal with Nscale. SpaceX's xAI plans to deploy Nvidia's Vera processor in future data centers as well. Now, that concentration leaves Nvidia increasingly dependent on just a handful of customers who, as we've shown recently, can bargain very hard, design their own chips, or simply walk away. Now, so far, it looks like the purchase will still leave model files available to download. Nvidia, though, gains influence over the defaults, the recommendations, and the integrations that decide which models people find first and which hardware feels easiest to use. A well-funded owner can argue that it will maintain and improve the platform, and Nvidia may well do exactly that. But claiming stewardship still benefits a company that now stands to own both the dominant compute layer and the main storefront for alternatives. It reminds me of the old company towns where you lived in a town where the houses were all owned by the company, who also owned the only stores, and the only money accepted was company scrip. And then a counterweight showed up in the same news cycle. The mysterious Ox Alpha model posted scores close to the frontier on some of the public benchmarks. It turned out to come from Z.ai, the Chinese lab behind the GLM model family. Z.ai released it into the same open ecosystem that Nvidia is now buying. So for a developer building with open models, this deal may change three things: what shows up at the top of a search, which integrations arrive first, and which hardware works the smoothest. Those choices can shape an entire market without ever closing off access. Still, this storefront cannot fully control what it sells. Once capable model weights exist as downloadable files, copying them costs almost nothing compared with the cost of training them. Developers can still mirror the models, move them, and run them on different hardware. That copying limits how much leverage Nvidia gets over discovery, but it doesn't necessarily erase that leverage. The purchase looks like a leader's move made by someone who can already see the substitution coming. Nvidia can end up owning the busiest doorway into the field, but so far, Nvidia cannot own every model that passes through it. All right, the debate over hidden default settings comes even closer to home for families whose kids use Instagram and Facebook. Meta has agreed to pay up to $18 billion over 10 years to settle the multi-state teen addiction trial. What did the states get from this deal that money alone couldn't buy, though? The lawsuit spanned 48 states, Washington, D.C., and several territories. It grew from allegations that Meta designed its recommendation systems to keep children hooked, while treating the features that drove that use as just ordinary product choices. The settlement changes Meta's legal footing on this. Pending judicial approval, Meta agreed to a default 2-hour daily limit on most use of Facebook and Instagram by minors in participating U.S. jurisdictions, removable only with parental permission. By default, the apps will also block teen access from midnight to 6 a.m., except for direct messages. Meta will mute most notifications during school hours, and they will ban plastic surgery beauty filters that testimony linked to body image harm for minors. An independent auditor will check whether Meta actually follows these rules, and about $5.3 billion of the payout is conditional on whether YouTube and TikTok adopt similar limits and match the payment. Meta's chief legal officer framed that condition as a challenge for the whole industry to follow. Now, for families, this settlement is a hard-won change. One parent said to the AP, "It felt like today finally something was done." But this fix does bring its own risk that we should talk about here. Age assurance does mean checking or estimating how old each user is, and that requires Meta to collect identity information across its products, even from adults. The Electronic Frontier Foundation warned that this lets the platform watch users without the users being able to watch back. Hackers or government agencies could then target that identity record, including for demands involving things like abortion or gender-affirming care. And I bring that up because that has actually happened in things like flock cameras, for example. The AP also cautioned that the deal allows Meta to define harm. In other words, Meta can determine what is harmful and what is not. So the lasting win here is that Meta must now design its product with a duty of care of some sort. A notification during school, an endless feed, or a filter that changes how a teen looks. Each one is a design choice that the company made. Regulators can now require a company to answer for what that choice does to children. The power imbalance between teens and platforms is also important here. Minors and parents faced a platform that designed the environment, measured every interaction, and controlled the evidence about how it worked. Independent auditing starts to balance that power back toward families. But age checks could tip that power back toward the platform. Protecting kids should not require everyone else to hand over more identity data to the very company being reined in here. People being watched need a way to check the watcher, to challenge its decisions, and to find out whether their data leaves the platform. Now, this settlement proves that companies can be compelled to change harmful designs, and this standard of independent auditing should spread to other platforms. Its surveillance burden should not. All right, that question of who gets to see becomes real in an operating room where 48-year-old Reese Hibbert was at risk of losing his sight. An 11-millimeter tumor on his pituitary gland was pressing against his optic nerves. Now, what role did AI play when London surgeons took it out? Pituitary surgery works through a narrow space crowded with critical structures. The optic nerves, carotid arteries, and delicate blood vessels sit just millimeters from the surgeon's instruments. One wrong move can cost a patient their vision. During Hibbert's operation in May, surgeons at University College London hospitals worked through an endoscope, which is the small camera doctors use to see inside the surgical field. Engineers had trained the systems on hundreds of earlier operation videos. The AI read that live camera feed and highlighted parts of the surgeon's view in color. It marked the nerves and the vessels that the instruments needed to avoid. The surgeons kept full control of every movement, while the system kept mapping the anatomy in front of them. Hibbert did not lose his sight. The hospital called it the world's first AI-assisted brain tumor removal. The National Institute for Health and Care Research and Google funded the program. So far, this is one patient in a clinical program. A larger trial comes next, and then the work needed for approval and everyday hospital use. In an operation like this, surgeons can only notice so much while under pressure. A surgeon must keep the whole field in mind while making tiny movements next to structures that can't be repaired after just one mistake. AI can start to take on some of that watching. It can watch the same view, track every marked structure, and never tire or blink. That gives the surgeon a second set of eyes, while judgment and action stay in human hands. One successful operation, though, doesn't put this system in every operating room. It does, however, prove a critical core point. AI can read a live surgical field well enough to help lower the risk for the person on the table. For Reese Hibbert, that possibility meant something real. He can still see. All right, let's bring it to a close for today. Can an institution check its own work? And should it? It can investigate, it can publish the evidence, it can even expose the failures that make its systems better. What it cannot and should not do alone is earn the final word. OpenAI's case grew stronger once METR could inspect the training records and Alabama could demand documents. Meta safeguards gained force once an independent auditor became part of the settlement. Nvidia may own Hugging Face, but open models can still come from outside its reach and spread as files nobody there controls. A protein once called undruggable for 40 years now has an approved medicine that holds it still for much longer. A surgeon working next to a patient's optic nerves can now share the live view with an AI that tracks the anatomy continuously. Now we need to keep checking these gains because of what they change, and that checking has to keep up with the capability. But that does not mean handing permanent control to the same old gatekeeper or to some new one. It means opening up the evidence so more people can test what happened, find what failed, and improve what comes next. A lab's own grade can start the conversation, yes, but in the end, what matters is results that hold up once the rest of us can see the work. See you tomorrow.